The next part of 5.2 is factoring by grouping. Now, luckily, because we used AC split method earlier in our previous factoring units, that is very similar to grouping. So when we are grouping, we're going to group together the first two terms and the last two terms. When you are grouping, you cannot use this method when you have an odd number of terms. So you can't group when you only have 3 terms, and you can't group when you only have 5 terms. So you want to make sure you are using this method once you get 4 terms in your polynomial. When we group them together, then you're going to factor out your greatest common factor from that pair or that group. So our first group here, we had an x cubed minus 3x squared. We are going to have exponents on our variables that we are going to be able to factor out. So when you're factoring out, you want to look for the lowest exponent of that common variable. So both of these have x's, and the lowest exponent was an x squared. That tells us we're going to be able to factor out that x squared. And when you're factoring it out, that is the same thing, or we're going to use the exponent rule like we would when we're dividing. So when we have x cubed and we're factoring out an x squared, we are subtracting from that exponent the 2 that we took out. So that would leave us with just x to the power of 1, which is the same thing as x. Then when we factor out an x squared from a minus 3x squared, that would just leave us with the minus 3. Okay. Then if we look at the second group, we do not have a variable with both of them, so we're going to just look at the coefficients and see if we can factor out a number. When the first value is negative, you are going to be factoring out a negative, so make sure you don't forget that. And then 4 and 12, the GCF, or the greatest common factor, is 4, so we can factor that out from both of them. From a negative 4x, if we factor out a negative 4, we are left with x. And then a positive 12, when we factor out a negative 4, we're going to get the opposite sign. And then we would be left with a 3. Once you are here, you should have 2 sets of parentheses that are the same. So what we're doing here is we're going to factor that out. And I want you to think about this as x squared times b minus 4 times b. So what we're doing is we're factoring out our greatest common factor from these 2 terms. And in this example over on the side, our greatest common factor would be b. And then we're left with x squared minus 4. We're doing the same thing, except now our greatest common factor is x minus 3. And we're factoring that out from both of these. So that would give us an x minus 3. And then the remaining parts are what we would be left with in the parentheses, or in other words, the x squared minus 4. Okay, now after you factor by grouping, we need to check, are we able to factor any further? So with the first one, x minus 3, there's no greatest common factor. There's no exponent on the x, so that one can't be factored any further. But if we look at the second parenthesis, this x squared minus 4, I notice x squared is a perfect square. So I need to check, is 4 a perfect square? Which it is. And we're subtracting. So that means we have a difference of squares that we can factor using, or with that second set of parentheses. So we are going to do difference of squares. To do that, you find the square root of x squared, which is x, and the square root of 4, and that is 2. That first parenthesis, just going to stay the same, x minus 3. And then this one, we are factoring using difference of squares, would give us one parenthesis with x plus 2, and then one with x minus 2. Once we no longer have any exponents, we are going to be good on factoring. So that would be our completely factored answer. So after you group, double check for difference of cubes, difference of squares, sum of squares, any of those where it's possible to continue factoring. Okay, so you should go ahead, try the last 2 examples on your own, and then you can jump to the end of the video to see the answers, or you can watch and follow along as I go through them. All right. So when we're grouping, we have 4 terms we can group, and there's no common factor between all 4 of them. So for this one, our GCF is 1, so I'm going to just start with grouping. If I look at this between x cubed minus x squared, I'm going to factor out an x squared because that has the lowest exponent. And when I factor it out, it's the same thing as our quotient or dividing rule. With exponents, I'm subtracting from that exponent. So x cubed, if we take away 2 of those x's that we're multiplying, we would be left with 1 of them. And then when I factor out an x squared from a minus x squared, I'm going to be left with a negative 1. And you have to make sure you put that 1 there, otherwise it's going to change the problem. Now I can move on to the second pair. The first number is negative, so I know I have to factor out a negative. We don't have any variables with both of them, so I'm not going to factor out a variable. Both of them do have a 2, so I can factor out a negative 2 for this problem. So negative 2x, factor out a 2, I'd be left with x. Positive 2, if I factor out a negative 2, I'm going to be left with a negative 1. So when you factor out a negative, the signs are going to change. Now I have an x minus 1 in both of my parentheses, so I'm going to factor that out. So I'm taking that x minus 1 and putting it up front because that is my common factor between these. And then the remaining pair is going to be left, and we would have x squared minus 2. Now I need to check, can I factor further? This first one, x minus 1, I don't have a common factor, and the exponent on the x is just a 1, so we're not going to factor any further. My second set, I do have an x squared, so that's squared, and we're subtracting, so I need to check, is 2 a perfect square? And it is not. So because that's not a perfect square, I am done factoring because I cannot factor that any further. Okay, so that's our answers for A and B. The next one, hopefully you've tried it. You are going to start with your GCF. This one, I noticed all of these numbers are divisible by 6. And then also, we have x's with all of them, so I'm going to factor out that x with the lowest exponent, which would be 1. So when I factor out a 6x, make sure you do write it in the front. I am going to have, so over here, I took out one of these x's that we are multiplying. That's going to leave me with an x cubed. And then I factored out a 6 from the 12. That would leave me with a 2. And I factored out one of these x's that are being multiplied together. That will leave me with an x squared. And then I factored out, again, a 6 from the 12. That'll leave me with a 2. And I took away one of these x's that we're multiplying. That leaves with 1x. And then if I factor out a 6 from 24, that would give me 4. And I took away that x on the last one. So this would be my factored answer after I take out my GCF. Now in the parentheses, I do have 4 terms, so I'm going to try factoring by grouping. So I'm going to group together the first 2. And while I'm grouping, I'm going to change this parenthesis here to a bracket. And it's okay if you leave it as a parenthesis, but sometimes it gets confusing when you have multiple sets. Looking at my first group, I can factor out an x squared here. That will leave me with just x plus 2. Then my second pair starts with a positive, so I'm going to factor out a positive value. They don't have x's with both of them, but I can factor out a 2 from both of them. That will leave me with x plus 2. Okay, now I'm going to write my final factored answer. You have to keep your GCF, so I'm keeping this 6x. And then I have this common factor of x plus 2, so I'm going to write that next to my GCF. And then I have my remaining parts of x squared plus 2. Okay, after I factor that, I need to double check, do I have anything else that can be factored? This first parenthesis, they don't have any common factors, so that one's done. The second one, we do have an x squared, but we're adding a 2. So there's no common factor, and I can't factor x plus 2 any further. because it doesn't follow any of our special properties and there's only 2 terms. So that is my final answer for factoring by grouping. So make sure you check your 3 examples, that you factored them all the way, and that you have the correct answer. Remember, the order of the parentheses does not matter as long as you have the same thing in the parentheses.